Last week we talked about if statements and using them to decide whether to execute a section of code or not execute that based on the condition. This week we're going to expand upon that idea a little bit more. We're going to have a program where, let's say the user used more than 400 minutes, we would display one message: you went over by 100 minutes. But if they used fewer than 400 minutes, we'd display a different message: you have 50 minutes remaining. So it's not one section of code that we're going to execute or not execute, but we're really using two sections of code, and we're deciding, do we display the message for going over, or do we display the message for having minutes remaining? So if we look at our section of code last time, where we said, did they use more than 400 minutes? If yes, then we do one section of code. If no, then we just continue. In order to run the program I just described, we just have to make a few changes here. We have to change our yes to just display the number of minutes they went over, but we need to add a section of code to the no. So we put this display minutes remaining, and our no goes to that now, instead of just skipping. So now we've got our condition, more than 400 minutes, and if it's yes, we do one thing, if it's no, we do something else, and then at the end we continue with the rest of our program. So let's skip the calculation here, but we write it in this way. If minutes is greater than 400, then we'll have a print statement: you went over your minutes. And then here's the new part: else, we display the other statement: you have minutes remaining. That else runs if our condition is not true. So if minutes is greater than 400, we do the first thing. If minutes is greater than 400 is false, we do the second section of code. We do the section after the else. Here's our code from last week. Let's use an else statement to rewrite it, and I think it'll make it a little easier to read and understand. So last week we said the cost is $50 for our cell phone plan. But if you go more than 400 minutes, then there's this extra cost. We figure out how many minutes you go over, and it's 10 cents per minute in addition to the original cost. Let's switch this to an else statement. So now we say, well, if you go over 400 minutes, here's how I figure out your cost. It's $50 plus the cost of the extra minutes. Else, so if you don't go over 400 minutes, then cost is just equal to 50. This splits it into two pretty clear different scenarios and is a little bit easier to understand. You'll notice we still declare that variable cost up at the top. We have to do that because we want to use it after our if statement. But we don't have to give it a value. Java will notice that we've got an if else. So one of these two sections will run, and cost gets set in the if section and it gets set in the else section. So it knows by the time our if else is done, cost will have a value of some kind. Let's see this code in action. Let's assume the user used 300 minutes. We'd create this variable cost, and we'd look, 300 greater than 400, that's false. So we'll run the code in the else section. Cost is equal to 50, and we'll display at the bottom, you owe $50. Well, what if the user had 500 minutes? Well, we'd create the variable cost, 500 greater than 400, that's true, so we'll run the if section. We'll figure out 100 extra minutes, we figure out the additional cost of that, the total will be 60, and so we'll display 60 at the bottom. You may be wondering, why do we use the else? We could actually have written the same program using two if statements. We could have an if statement that says, if I go over the 400 minutes, and another if statement that says, if I don't go over the 400 minutes. Well, there's a few advantages to the else, and hopefully this code will help demonstrate that. The first is this cost variable. You'll notice we're getting an error down here saying it may not have been initialized. Even if we wrote this code perfectly, what Java sees is one if statement followed by another if statement. One of those two should happen. Either the user goes over their minutes or they don't go over their minutes. So cost will get a value either way. But Java can't tell. Java just sees an if statement. It knows the code inside of an if statement might not run. It sees another if statement. It knows the code inside of an if statement might not run. So it thinks it's possible this code doesn't run, it's possible this code doesn't run, and then cost never gets a value. We can fix that. We can get rid of the error message and set cost equal to 0. But it's kind of unfortunate to have to do that. We're basically putting a value in there that we never want to happen at the end. This should never be 0 when we're done. The second problem is I've actually made an error here. I've said if minutes is greater than 400, and then I've said if minutes is less than 400. What if minutes is exactly equal to 400? Well, this if statement will be false. This if statement, the condition will be false. none of this code will run, and we'll actually end up with a cost of 0. That's really bad if we're the cell phone company. We don't want to give people free minutes. So let's fix that. Let's say if minutes is less than or equal to 400. That's fixed now. This will definitely get the correct answer, but you can see it's pretty easy to accidentally create that error. And the second thing is what happens if we change the number of minutes. We'll see a better way to do this later, but we might change it. Let's say the plan now includes 500 minutes. We might change it in one if statement, but forget to change it in the other if statement. And we want to avoid even having that possibility if we can. So you've seen now that an else helps us decide which of two sections of code should run. But what if we have many sections of code, like this example where we have 4 different things that might happen? The user used more than 500 minutes, we'll say they went way over. Or they used fewer than that, but more than 400. They used exactly 400, or maybe they used fewer than 400. We have a different message for each of those scenarios. You could picture we could kind of create a flowchart that looks like this. First, we ask, did they use more than 500 minutes? If they did, then we're done with this section of code. We display they went way over, and then we continue running the rest of the code. But if they didn't use more than 500, then we ask another question. Did they use more than 400? If they did, we display a message. But if they didn't, we ask another question. Did they use exactly 400? If they did, we again display a message, exactly right. But if none of those first 3 things are true, then they must have used fewer than 400 minutes. We'll display the message they have extra minutes. So we can write this in Java code as well, using one section of code, using something called an else if. So the first condition we do exactly the way we've done before. We say if minutes is greater than 500, and I won't translate this section into Java code, but we'll just have our message they went way over. But this, we really don't want a separate if statement, because if they use 600 minutes, for example, both of these two if statements would be true. If minutes is greater than 500 would be true. If minutes is greater than 400 would also be true. So we only want to ask this, is minutes greater than 400, if our first condition was false. And we do that using an else if. Else if means if this previous condition was false, then let me ask if this condition is true. So if it's not more than 500 minutes, but it is more than 400 minutes, we'll display the message they went a little bit over. Another else if none of the first 2 things are true, but the minutes is exactly equal to 400, then we'll display the message exactly right. And then we can end with an else. If none of these 3 conditions are true, then we'll display the message that they have extra minutes. Let's see that translated into Java code written more normally. We have if minutes is greater than 500, and then we'll print out you went way over. If that's not true, but minutes is greater than 400, we'll print out you went a little over. If none of those 2 things are true, but minutes is exactly equal to 400, we have another message. And if none of those 3 things are true, we end up with this else. You have extra minutes. Let's see that in action. Let's say that the user had 450 minutes. It would first ask, is 450 greater than 500? It's not, so it skips down. Then it says, is 450 greater than 400? It is. We display our printout, and that's the end. We continue with the rest of the code. How about with 300 minutes? Well, 300 greater than 500, that's false. So we look at the next section. 300 greater than 400, that's false. 300 is equal to 400, that's false. We've tried all the if and the else ifs, so we're down at the else. We're going to display out the message that you have extra minutes. So if, else if, you can have as many else ifs if you'd like. We're really looking at what is the first condition that is true. So if minutes is greater than 500 is true, we don't look at any of the other conditions. But if it's false, then we'll look at the next else if. And if that's false, we'll look at the next else if. And we'll continue until we hit an else. And to show you one last easy error to make, I've flipped the first 2 conditions. So now it says if minutes is greater than 400, we'll print out you went a little over. Else if minutes is greater than 500, we'll print out you went way over. This isn't going to work. And let's say that minutes is equal to 550. That'll demonstrate how. So we'll run our code here. If 550 is greater than 400, that's true. We'll display you went a little over. And then we'll jump down to the bottom to continue running the code after this section of. So we never look at if minutes is greater than 500. we just look at the first condition that's true. Minutes is greater than 400. We run that code, and then we skip the rest of our if-else-if section.